The chapter we read and the topic we're talking about have to do with the existence of theology as an independent discipline. Should theology exist, or is human reason enough? And we've already hinted at these topics when we looked at the relationship between faith and reason, between human faith and divine faith. Now we really want to consider, when it comes to the nature of theology as a discipline, the two orders of knowledge about God. That there are indeed two ways of coming to know God that really distinguish the disciplines of philosophy based on human reason and theology, which is grounded in faith in what God has revealed. So we're going to look at these two orders of knowledge about God in the context of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So these following slides are all taken from paragraphs 31 to 38 of the Catechism, and that kind of gives us a picture of this these two orders of knowledge about God. So it wants to tell us that there's more than one way of coming to know God. It says that created in God's image and called to know Him and love Him, the person who seeks God discovers certain ways of coming to know Him. And notice echoes of a few things we talked about in just the previous videos. This necessity of the human person to reflect upon God. Well, the necessity is we need to be created in God's image, right? And called to know Him and love Him. That is, we're created in God's image with an intellect that can know the truth and a will that can choose to love. So created in God's image and called to know and love Him, the human person who seeks God discovers certain ways of coming to know Him. These are also called proofs for the existence of God. Now we're in the realm of reason here, of philosophy. These proofs for the existence of God. Not in the sense of proofs in the natural sciences, but rather in the sense of converging and convincing arguments which allow us to attain certainty about the truth. So the proofs for the existence of God are not the same as proofs for an empirical fact or proofs for the Pythagorean theorem, mostly because God is not an object like other objects. He's not one thing among many. We don't prove persons. So these proofs are more like taking a child by the hand to show them something. It's a method of more of show and tell of the reality of God than it is the Pythagorean theorem proof. A few of the videos a little bit lower down on the populi screen will be some examples of these ways of coming to know God, some of the approaches to God through these proofs. So these ways of approaching God, these proofs, which it calls here ways, these ways of approaching God from creation have a twofold point of departure, the physical world and the human person. So it's telling us, well, how do we know God through reason? Where do these so-called proofs or ways start? It's from creation, from the things around us. And in two ways. First, the physical world, that is the world outside of us, and then the human person, that is the world within us. So we're going to look at each of those in turn, coming to know God through the world. The world, in this sense, we look around us. The starting point is from things like movement or becoming or contingency, the fact that things don't have to exist, but they do. And the world's order and beauty. From these things, one can come to a knowledge of God as the origin and the end of the universe. This is referring to some of these arguments for the existence of God, from motion and from causality and from order. These are examples of St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways to come to know the existence of God from reason. And as I mentioned, a few of the next videos will highlight just some basic presentations of these. But notice it starts where we start with all of our knowledge, from the world around us. As St. Paul says of the Gentiles, this is Romans 1:20, for what can be known about God is plain to them. To those without, this is the Gentiles, without revelation. Why? Because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, His invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So St. Paul is saying it's through creation, through reflecting on the world, that we can come to know the Creator. We can know the cause, God, through the effects that we see. We can also come to know God, though, through the human person. That is, by this interior reflection upon ourselves. With his openness to truth and beauty, his sense of moral goodness, his freedom and the voice of his conscience, with his longings for the infinite and for happiness, man questions himself about God's existence. So this goes back to the videos we talked about the human person's experience of standing open before God, the person who questions, the person who suffers, the person who experiences. I want to highlight here the idea of conscience. The sense of moral goodness, that we have this law within us that we didn't place there, that we can't seem to get rid of, that we know just written on our hearts that it's wrong to torture kittens for fun. It simply is wrong. We know that. It doesn't need to be taught to us. We can certainly destroy that sense within us through action or through will, but it remains the fact that our conscience is this law within us that we didn't place there that seems to echo God's will for us. So it goes on to say, in all of this, he discerns signs of his spiritual soul. It seems like this can't be the result of a mere mechanical programming. The soul, the seed of eternity we bear in ourselves, is irreducible to the merely material and can have its origin only in God. So the idea with both of these is that by looking at the world around us, by looking at the person that we are, the thing that we are within, this internal reflection, we realize that they are inexplicable according to natural causes and can only point to God. Now, any one of these examples, of course, could be developed quite a bit further. So the world and man attest that they contain within themselves neither their first principle nor their final end, but rather that they participate in being itself, which alone is without origin or end. That is to say that the world and the human person are not self-explanatory. They point beyond themselves to that which is ultimately self-explanatory. Thus, in different ways, man can come to know that there exists a reality which is the first cause and final end of all things, a reality, in the language of St. Thomas Aquinas, that everyone calls God. Now, this is true of human reason, but there are limits to our natural knowledge of God. Man's faculties, that is, our intellect and will, make him capable of coming to a knowledge of the existence of God as to the existence of a personal God. But for man to be able to enter into a real intimacy with him, God willed both to reveal himself to man and to give him the grace of being able to welcome this revelation in faith. So while we can know things like there's an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover or some author of the moral law, what our human intellect cannot provide is our ability to enter into communion with God, to an intimate share in God's life and love. For that, something more had to be supplied, God's revelation of himself and the grace to respond to that in faith. So we can say that, well, human reason does give us a picture of God. It gives us a very thin slice of the God who is Trinity, who is incarnate in Jesus Christ, who has a plan for our salvation. The proofs of God's existence, however, can predispose one to faith and help one to see that faith is not opposed to reason. Even though there's limits to our natural knowledge of God, it's not useless. And it's not useless even in relation to faith. Those proofs can predispose us to faith. It can remove obstacles. It can remove objections. It can show us that faith is not wishful thinking. Faith is not a mere blind impulse of the mind. Faith is not simply gibberish. Right? These arguments show the credibility of it all. Help one to see that faith is not opposed to reason, that the head is baptized as well, right? That we don't check our intellects at the door of the church. So what does the church say about this knowledge of God. Quoting from the First Vatican Council, which we've already looked at, the Catechism says, "Our Holy Mother, the Church, holds and teaches that God, the first principle and last end of all things, can be known with certainty from the created world by the natural light of human reason." So we can know God with certainty without revelation. That is possible. And these arguments and proofs for the existence of God point us in that direction. Without this capacity, right, without this standing open to the existence of God, man would not be able to welcome God's revelation. That is to say, how would I welcome God's revelation if there was no evidence for his existence, right? Faith in God's revelation presupposes that it's credible to believe that God exists and he's revealed himself. Man has this capacity because he is created in the image of God. So this brings us back from all those first videos from this section. How is it that we stand with this capacity for revelation? We are created in the image and likeness of God as beings with intellect and will, as persons standing before a personal God. Now, it speaks about the possibility of coming to know God through human reason, but it's not without difficulty. The Catechism says that in the historical conditions in which he finds himself, however, man experiences many difficulties in coming to know God by the light of reason alone. And experience tells us this, that many people don't come to belief in God simply based on the right argument or the right proof. It goes on to say, though human reason is strictly speaking truly capable of attaining to a true and certain knowledge of God and of the natural law written in our hearts, yet there are many obstacles which prevent reason from the effective and fruitful use of this inborn faculty. You could say that every human intellect, every typical human intellect, I guess, is capable of deriving the Pythagorean theorem, but not everyone does. So simply because the human person has a particular capacity doesn't mean that it's achieved by every individual person. So there are these difficulties in coming to know God. Well, what are they? Well, the truths that concern the relations between God and man, first of all, wholly transcend the visible order of things. They go beyond the typical things that we know and see and talk about. And if they are translated into human action and influence it, they call for self-surrender and abnegation. So there's this added element. Not only is it difficult for the intellect, but it's difficult for the will, that once I realize that there is a creator who's placed a moral law within me, who's revealed himself, I need to offer self-surrender. So there are obstacles for both intellect and will when it comes to this natural knowledge of God. The human mind, in its turn, is hampered in the attaining of such truths not only by the impact of the senses and the imagination, but also by disordered appetites, which are the consequences of original sin. So again, our intellect is weakened by original sin, and or I should say our intellect is darkened by original sin, and our will is weakened. So even though we have these inbuilt capacities to recognize God through reason, it is only with difficulty that many would be able to do it. So it happens that men in such matters easily persuade themselves that what they would not like to be true is false or at least doubtful. So the will enters in. The Catechism is suggesting here, and we'll see John Paul II suggested this too, that the denial of the existence of God is never a merely purely intellectual exercise, that the will is often or always involved, that we can persuade ourselves that what we don't want to be true, in fact, isn't. This difficulty is what makes revelation necessary. This is why man stands in need of the second order of knowledge about God, right? This is why man stands in need of being enlightened by God's revelation, not only about those things that exceed his understanding, like the mystery of the Trinity, God's plan for our salvation, but also about those religious and moral truths which of themselves are not beyond the grasp of human reason. Why? So that even in the present condition of the human race, they can be known by all, with ease, and with firm certainty and no admixture of error. So where the intellect is darkened and the will is weakened, revelation not only bridges the gap for those things we couldn't possibly know, but also those things that we could know but only some people would know, or with great difficulty, or with this admixture of error. And so what this sets us up for is two orders of knowledge about God. A certain knowledge that we can come to with our human reason, and then a certain knowledge that comes through faith in what God has revealed. And what we'll see as we go forward and talk in class is these two orders of knowledge are mutually enriching, stand in no conflict, certainly no contradiction, but actually mutually support one another in the fullness of knowledge.